Thank you so much, Chair Carlton. We are live to the broadcast and you may call the meeting to order when you are ready.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I will go ahead and call the Interim Retirements and Benefits Committee meeting to order. The agenda has been duly posted. We will start out with public comment or roll call. Ms. Kaufman, if you would go ahead and do the roll call, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Brooks?
Here.
Senator Severs-Gansert?
Here.
Senator Orenshaw?
Here.
Assemblywoman Kasama? Assemblywoman Peter?
Thank you so much, Chair Carlton and members. I apologize for the interruption. We are now back live to the broadcast and you may re-begin at public comment when you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are back. I'd like to go ahead and go back to Ms. Kaufman. I believe Assemblywoman Kasama is now present. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, that is correct.
Okay, so please mark Assemblywoman Kasama present. And with that, moving forward, we'll go to public comment. I'll make the announcement again in case we didn't get it out there to the public. Public comment will be limited to 2 minutes per person. The access number to call in was posted on the agenda. You can also make public comment by submitting an email, which was also posted on the agenda. We'll give it just a moment for folks to be able to dial in, and then we will go to public comment. Broadcast services, if there's anyone in the queue, please queue them up.
Thank you, Chair. To give public comment, please press raise hand in your Zoom window or *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue.
Doug Unger, UNLV Chapter President and Government Affairs Representative, Nevada Faculty Alliance. Thank you, Chair Carlton and the committee for your consideration. This is the season of the Great Resignation. Unprecedented numbers of workers are quitting their jobs, 3.9 million per month, reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and Nevada is also experiencing worker flight, including NSHE, according to our chancellor, along with almost all state offices. Understaffing for the Department of Corrections is now a crisis and a civil rights concern. Among the reasons for the loss of state workers are inadequate COLA increases last session and substandard health insurance and benefits from pandemic budget cuts to PEB, which have not yet been restored. The state took back $25 million in its employer contribution holiday, the first time the legislature has swept PEB in this way and not paid it back. And state contributions are at least $20 million per year less than they were 3 years ago. Out-of-pocket maximums are now $5,000 for an individual and $10,000 for a family, which feels like deliberate punishment. Life insurance is cut in half. Long-term disability insurance is eliminated during a time when, because of the risk of contracting long-haul COVID-19, the likelihood of disability has increased. We have repeatedly asked the Interim Finance Subcommittee and the Governor's Office for American Rescue Plan funds to remedy the drastic cuts to PEB. We've been told no by the powers that be without even the courtesy of an explanation why. No wonder state workers are leaving their jobs. We ask you, please, to do all you can to restore the PEB budget to pre-pandemic levels. It's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Next caller, please.
Thank you. And sorry, can you hear me?
Sorry, caller, please proceed.
Thank you and good afternoon, Chair Carlton and fellow committee members Brooks, Orenshaw, Sievers, Gansert, Kasama, and Peters. My name for the record is Terry Laird, spelled Terri Laird, and I'm the Executive Director and Lobbyist for RPEN, the Retired Public Employees of Nevada. Founded in 1976, RPEN lobbies on behalf of all public employees in Nevada to protect the pension and health care benefits they earn through their public service. We have nearly 8,000 dues-paying members, many of whom are retired and enjoying that well-deserved pension. You'll hear today from experts at Nevada's Public Employees Retirement System, PERS, and Public Employees Benefits Program, PEB, two groups that RPEN has been closely aligned with since our inception. Executives from both agencies write a regular column in our member newsletter that's mailed out 6 times a year to keep all of our members up to date. The pandemic over the last 2 years have had drastic impacts on PEB participants who have seen benefits slashed, as you heard from the previous caller, including life insurance and long-term disability. And now PEB is going to impose a COVID surcharge on all unvaccinated state employees in July. While we understand the need to cover additional costs PEB has incurred because of COVID, we don't like seeing state employees face additional cost increases, especially those who earn entry-level wages. We know that the state has received nearly $3 billion in American Rescue funding to be shared with all state agencies impacted by the pandemic, and we too hope PEB can benefit from some of those funds to possibly restore PEB benefits to those pre-pandemic levels. In regard to PERS, it goes without saying that PERS continues to outperform similar sized pension funds with their conservative investments that they'll explain during today's meeting. But there are some groups that would like to see PERS reformed from a defined benefit system to a hybrid defined benefit / defined contribution 401k for new hires only. RPEN has testified against such a plan before, and with another legislative session ahead next year, we hope our legislators will continue to support PERS and keep the defined benefit system in place, because what's not broken need not be fixed. Thank you for your legislative service to Nevada and to all public employees.
Next caller, please.
Kent Ervin, K-E-N-T-E-R-V-I-N for the Nevada Faculty Alliance. Good afternoon. First, I would like to congratulate PERS on their extraordinary investment performance in fiscal year 2021. Also last year, PERS changed assumptions on future returns and payroll growth to more conservative values, which makes PERS fiscally stronger in the long term. The unfunded liability is projected to be paid off by about 2034, after which contribution rates will drop steeply. However, the assumption changes will lead to higher contribution rates for the next several years, which state workers cannot afford with wages that are lagging far behind inflation. PERS can and must use actuarially sound methods to smooth out the contribution rates and not increase them again. As has been noted, the Public Employees Benefits Program budget was cut nearly $25 million per year in fiscal years 21, 22, and 23. Budgets were slashed, targeting vulnerable employees with chronic conditions with the high out-of-pocket maximums, or those with future disability with the elimination of the long-term disability insurance, which is just cruel. CARES Act funds reimbursed PEB about $14 million for COVID medical claims through December 2021, but we simply don't understand why American Rescue Plan Act revenue loss funds have not been allocated either for COVID costs for PEB or to restore benefits, at least for FY 2023. With state gaming and room tax revenue at all-time highs, it is shameful that state workers have not been made whole after working on the front lines throughout the pandemic. State agencies, including PERS, PEB, and Corrections, as well as NC, are having great difficulty hiring and keeping employees, in part because of non-competitive salaries and benefits. Benefits must be restored if the state is to have the high-quality workforce needed to achieve the goals of the American Rescue Plan Act and the state. Thank you.
Next caller.
Chair, there are no more callers in public comment at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we'll go ahead and move on to item number 3, which is approval of the minutes of the December 16th, 2020 meeting. Committee members, are there any questions, comments, clarifications, or corrections on those minutes?
Madam Chair, I'm just going to recuse myself since I wasn't here for that meeting.
Okay.
I will do the same. Assemblywoman Kasam.
All right. So with that, other committee members?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Orangeall?
thank you.
Orangeall.
I too was not present at that meeting, so I will abstain.
Well, then I believe we might have a bit of an issue because that would be 3 and 3. So Ms. Kaufman, is it necessary for members that were not here to actually abstain on a vote of the minutes? And with only 3 votes, are we still okay? Just making sure we clarify everything.
Madam Chair, for the record, this is Sarah Kaufman. I believe that you are okay, but we do have our legal staff, Eileen O'Grady, on as well, if she would be willing to weigh in on this.
Ms. Grady, are we good with the 3 members?
Yes, and it's not necessary for members to abstain on voting on it, even if they weren't there. They can read it and be okay with it. So either way is fine.
Okay, thank you, Thank you. Appreciate that. Just want to make sure everyone understood. So with that, I would accept a motion to approve the minutes of the December 16th, 2020 meeting from Ms. Peters and a second from
Second, Brooks.
Senator Brooks. I need to adjust my view so that I can see all of you. Thank you. Okay, there we go. Now it's better. So I have a motion and a second. Any questions or comments? Hearing none. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. You can raise your hand. Any in opposition? Seeing no opposition, I believe Ms. Kasama and Senator Sievers-Gansert did not vote. Senator Orenshaw did. So the motion passes. With that, we can move on to item number 4. Item 4 is the Public Employees Retirement System, Judicial Retirement System, and Legislators Retirement System. I believe we have Ms. Leese.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Are you ready for us to proceed?
Yeah, please go ahead and make your presentation, and then we will open it up to questions from the committee members.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, Chair, members of the committee. I'm Tina Liss. I'm the Executive Officer of the Public Employees Retirement System. Item 4.1, beginning on page 45 of your packet, outlines the executive staff salary modifications approved by the Retirement Board at its December meeting to begin in fiscal year 2023, pending this committee's approval. The proposed fiscal year 2023 maximum salaries for all positions except the Deputy Investment Officer position reflect the maximum salaries that's previously been approved by this committee and the Retirement Board. We have made the modifications for a cost of living adjustment that the board approved that was equal to that granted state employees in the 2021 legislature. It's also been adjusted to reflect the reduction in salary for the contribution rate change effective July 1st, 2021. The Deputy Investment Officer position was created in the 2021 legislative session, and that position is currently being paid in accordance with the approved budget by the 2021 legislature. Should the committee approve the salaries as fixed by the Retirement Board pursuant to NRS 286-160, a 1% COLA would be applied to all 9 statutory positions as of July 1st, 2022. The salaries are listed in your packet under the employer pay contribution plan. As by statute, these positions are required to be paid under the employer pay plan. The Retirement Board respectfully requests this committee's approval of the salaries for the 9 statutory positions of the retirement system as fixed by the Retirement Board as set forth in your packet. I'd be happy to answer any questions on the salaries.
Thank you very much. And committee members, this is something that we've done a number of different times. This is sort of the standard operating procedure on how we move forward with this. Are there any questions from any committee members on this item? Senator Sievers-Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So since it's employer paid, that means that no contribution will be made by the employee towards this. So if you're paid the executive officer, for example, the 171, 146, that's their net amount, and both sides of hers is paid by the state.
Tito, this for the record. Yes. So under the employer pay plan, the salary has been reduced for the employee's portion. So that's why you will see the, we have the two for you, the FY 2022 and FY 2023. So for instance, the FY 2022 was reduced for the contribution rate increase on that date. So what you see is, since it's been reduced for the contribution, then the employer pays 2 PERS, the employer's portion and the employee's portion. So there would be no further reduction on that for contributions of the employees. So yes, that is after contributions for retirement.
Okay, I just want to make sure we had that clear. Thank you.
Other questions? Not seeing any other questions from committee members. With that, I would go ahead and this is an item for action. So we will be taking a vote on this item. So with that, seeing no questions, I would accept a motion to approve this item from Ms. Peters, and a second from Senator Brooks. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand. And any in opposition? Seeing no opposition, passes unanimously. Thank you all very much. I believe we can move on to item number 2, which is the report on the Public Employees Retirement System.
Thank you. Tina Liss, Executive Officer of the Public Employees Retirement System. Item 4.2, beginning on page 47 of your packet, is an update on the fiscal year 2021 actuarial valuation for the PERS system. The Retirement Board, by policy, conducts an actuarial valuation to monitor the assets and liabilities associated with the pension plan. By statute, the valuation must be conducted on a biennial basis. By practice, the board does it on an annual basis. The statute requires a contribution rate or potential contribution rate changes based on the actuarial valuation that is conducted in the even numbered year for implementation in an odd numbered year. So for instance, since this is an odd numbered year valuation, this does not affect contribution rates. So this is the annual valuation that the board does to keep up with the projections, but this is not a valuation that is required by statute. Now, to project the costs and liabilities of the system, the board adopts assumptions about future events that affect the amount and timing of the benefits. As part of the valuation process, our actual experience is compared against this projected experience, and any deviations are recognized as gains and losses in the valuation process. Each year's actual experience may ultimately impact the actuarially calculated rates and ultimately the statutory rates that are adjusted pursuant to NRS 286.410 and .421. Now, the use of appropriate assumptions is really important to monitoring and maintaining adequate funding. To review assumptions, the Retirement Board conducts an experience study through its independent actuary every 4 to 6 years. In September, the system's actuarial firm, Siegel, performed an experience study in accordance with the Retirement Board's monitoring and reporting policy. This study covered the period July 2016 through June 2020. Based on trends in the data, the actuary recommended modifications to certain actuarial assumptions, which the board approved at their September 16, 2021 meeting. These assumptions were utilized in preparing the valuation for the date ended June 30, 2021. The demographic assumptions that were modified as a result of the experience study include retirement rates, mortality, termination rates, and disability rates. Economic assumptions that were modified include the investment return assumption, inflation, individual salary increases, and active member payroll. Demographic assumptions were modified to more closely reflect actual experience, and in the case of mortality, to move to a fully generational mortality table. The assumed investment rate of return was reduced from 7.5% to 7.25%. The assumed payroll growth was reduced from 5.5% to 3.5% for the regular fund, and from 6.5% to 3.5% for the police fire fund. Modifications to actuarial assumptions may have increasing or decreasing effects on the contribution rates. Generally, the changes to the assumptions in the 2021 experience study had increasing effects on the actuarial rates. Changes in the payroll growth, investment return, retirement rates, and mortality assumptions will likely have the largest impacts on actuarial calculated rates. The increasing effects of the assumption changes were magnified when applied to the 2021 valuation because we saw negative payroll growth during fiscal year 2021. So as I mentioned, we had an assumption of, for instance, 5.5% payroll growth for the regular fund, 6.5% for police fire. Those were both reduced to 3.5%, but in the 2021 fiscal year, we actually had negative payroll growth, so less than zero. Now, as part of the experience study, the Retirement Board considered a recommendation of the system's independent actuary to adopt an actuarial contribution phase-in approach for the contribution rate impact associated with these assumption changes. At its October meeting, the board adopted this actuarial approach for use beginning with fiscal year 2021 valuation. This approach smooths the impacts of the assumption changes over 4 years, similar to the 5-year asset smoothing that we have in place at the system. This actuarial method allows the liability changes from the assumption changes only, so just from the assumption changes, from the experience study to be recognized in a similar manner as our assets are recognized in that time period, so that we don't have a disconnect between the two, so that we are not smoothing the assets, but taking in the liability changes for assumptions all at once. Now, the 2021 valuation brought together a unique set of circumstances, a large investment gain, substantial assumption changes from the experience study, and negative payroll growth that make it difficult for us to predict where the contribution rates will be in the next few rate setting years. We can predict that there will be upward pressure on the rates because of the assumption changes. However, because of the other factors in play right now, we cannot predict where those will be by the next valuation. The assumption changes in the system's recent experience, the lack of payroll growth, the increased rate of retirements, and higher post-retirement increases likely will have increasing effects on the rates. In addition, the system experienced a large investment gain over the system's assumed rate of return. But due to the system's asset smoothing, only 20% of that gain has been recognized so far. So the 2021 valuation only recognizes 20% of that gain, and then we recognize 20% per year until it's fully recognized over a 5-year period. This has left the system with about $7.5 billion in unrecognized investment gains that will be recognized in the next 4 years with future investment gains and losses. Of course, this smoothing is in place to make sure that we don't have a lot of contribution rate volatility based on the up and down investment markets. But right now that is working in a manner that we do have $7.5 billion unrecognized as of June 30, 2021. Now, those unrecognized gains likely will have decreasing effects on the contribution rates that will partially offset the increases due to the liability changes. However, there are other factors in play right now that make predicting rates or what will even happen in fiscal year 2022 a little difficult. And those include where our future active membership goes, the rate of retirements, the inflation, which affects our post-retirement increases, and mortality. Because again, given the current environment, those are all factors that are not necessarily acting as you would have expected them to act over the last few decades. Now, the charts on page 51 and 52 in your packet show the changes in active membership in the regular and the police fire fund. The 2021 actuarial evaluation shows an overall decrease in active members from 111,815 to 106,910. That is a significant decrease in our active membership over one fiscal year. Rate payroll decreased by 2.89% in the regular fund and by 1.2% in the police fire fund. Lower than assumed total payroll results in lower level of contributions coming in as they are paid as a percentage of payroll. The charts on pages 53 and 54 contain information on the retiree membership and the average benefit amounts. The charts on pages 55 and 56 show the actuarially calculated rates for 2021. The actuarially calculated rate reflects both the asset smoothing and the rate impact smoothing of the assumption changes. The actuarially calculated rates would require, if this were a rate setting year, an increase in contribution rates in both the regular and police fire fund of approximately 2% and 4% respectively. Also shown on this page are what the actuarially calculated rates would be if we continued with asset smoothing and no rate impact smoothing. And then the final rate showed on here is what the rate would be if we had no asset smoothing and we had no rate impact smoothing. In that case, the regular fund increase with no asset smoothing and no rate impact smoothing would be a little bit lower than the actuarially calculated rate. The police fire fund would be a little higher than the actuarially calculated rates. Part of why we're showing you kind of these different scenarios is to kind of show the impact of the unrecognized gains and the assumption changes, and how until we have next year's experience, is difficult to predict where the contributions will go on the rate setting year. As I said, the ultimate impact will be not known until fiscal year 2022, and then somewhat beyond that, depending on how the liability changes roll in, and also depending on how the $7.5 billion in unrecognized gains roll in. If, for instance, we meet our investment assumptions right on, then all of that gain will be able to be rolled in, and that will have a significant impact on where those rates go. If we ultimately have to net those gains with losses in the future, then they will obviously not have as big an impact on the rates themselves. I did want to let this committee know that the board is working with the systems actuary under these interesting circumstances we have, under its constitutional authority to review all actuarial methods and assumptions to ensure that the ultimate recognition of the assets and changes in liabilities are done in an actuarially appropriate and responsible manner that makes sense for the system as a whole. Because again, it is a little bit of a unique circumstance where we have the large investment gain, but we have the negative payroll growth. Normally, you wouldn't see both of those coming in the same year. Now, the chart on page 57 shows the change in the actuarially determined rates broken into experience categories to show the origins of the increases and decreases. The rates shown on this are an average of the employer pay and the employee employer pay. As you can see, there were gains in investment return, salary increases, and normal costs, but those were more than offset by the losses due to payroll growth, contributions less than expected, post-retirement increases more than expected, and the assumption changes. The estimated time period until both plans are fully funded continues to decline. Based on the 2021 valuation, the amortization period for the regular fund is at 15.4 years, and the police fire fund 15.3 years. Those are both from June 30, 2021. Page 58 contains information on the actuarial funded ratio of the system. The actuarial funded ratio is based on the actuarial value of assets. And this is to smooth those ups and downs in the investment market. The actuarial liability declined a little bit to 75.3 for regular members, 75.6 for police fire, and in total 75.4. However, on a market value basis, which is what our financials are based upon under GASB, the market value of assets is used for your funded ratio, and that reflects the unrecognized gains. On a market value basis, the system's overall funded ratio increased to 86.5%. The final two pages show information regarding the market value of assets, the actuarial value assets, and the actuarial liabilities. This just kind of puts a picture on the impact of the large unrecognized gains that the system has right now. The difference is on the market value of assets, the total unfunded liability is about $9 billion. On an actuarial value of assets, it's about $16 billion. So that's kind of where we are at with this actuarial valuation. Again, it is a non-rate setting year, and we will have a lot more information as to the rate setting valuation once we hit the end of our current fiscal year on June 30, 2022. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions on this valuation.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of information. I see Ms. Peters with her hand up. We'll go to Assemblywoman Peters first, and then I see Ms. Kasama after. So, Ms. Peters.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much. And thank you for this breadth of information. New to me to be diving into this, and I just want to make sure that I have all of the information that you were talking about. can you go over again what factors you may have said were contributing to the actuarially determined contribution rates being greater than the statutory rates for the 21-23 biennium?
Tina List for the record. Yes, so each valuation period, we measure the experience. So our gains and losses against our assumptions. So for instance, we assume there will be certain number of salary or certain value for salary increases. We assume there will be a certain amount of payroll growth. We assume there will be a certain number of deaths. We assume there will be a certain number of retirement rates. And so when we do evaluation each year, we see how our experience is against what actually are against our assumptions, and we can have gains and losses there. That is not, however, the biggest contributing factor in this particular valuation. So in this valuation, we had an experience study, and we do those approximately 4 to 6 years. And what those do is we take a look back and we say, okay, how's our mortality assumption working? How is our payroll growth assumption working? And if we find that our experience is deviating consistently from those assumptions, then we will make changes to the assumptions. And when you make changes to those assumptions, that will ultimately raise or lower the cost of the benefits. A good example is if we change the mortality assumption, we assume, for instance, everyone now is going to live a year longer than we previously assumed. Well, that will raise our costs because now we assume we're going to pay benefits for a year longer than we previously thought we were going to. And this could be for people who are already retired. This would be for people that are currently working. So that can contribute to your unfunded liability. It can contribute to your normal costs. So when we make those changes to assumptions to reflect our experience and actually to reflect the costs of the system, those can increase your contribution rate. So the increase you're seeing for the most part in this valuation comes from the changing of the actuarial assumptions to more truly reflect the experience that we've been seeing over the 5-year period. The biggest changes, I think, from a cost perspective is the fact that our payroll growth is lower than assumed, which means we haven't been receiving the contributions that we assumed we would be receiving. And our retirement rates, we had to make a significant adjustment to the rates of retirements based on the experience, the recent experience. And when you assume people either retire earlier or more expensively than you assumed, then that increased our costs. So all that going into it, that's how we project the ultimate cost, which we then bring that back to the contribution rate. So that is why the contribution rates in this valuation would show an increase, because we essentially have had to true up those assumptions, which then makes the benefits that we're going to pay somewhat more expensive based on the assumption themselves.
May I follow up, Cheryl?
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Peters.
Thank you. So I'm trying to wrap my head around how you use this experience to project. And coming from an engineering field, is this a statistical analysis that you use, or is it less qualitative and more less quantitative and more qualitative in how you interpret those experience values? I guess what I'm wondering is, do you utilize like outlier theories and ways of addressing some of these factors that are really unique to our this period of time, the last 4 to 6 years, or is this really just a point in time look at those 6 years and you use everything that's involved in it?
Tina List for the record, it's an actuarial analysis done by the independent actuary that the board hires. So the nuts and bolts of it really is more of a question to be answered by the actuary, but kind of a higher level view, I think, of how they perform that. They do have certain actuarial standards of practice, of course, that they need to follow when they do these. But the length of time that they look at, the experience study covers a 5-year period, but depending on the nature of the assumption, they may take a longer look. For instance, economic assumptions, which would be rate of inflation, our investment rate of return, payroll growth. those, they tend to take a longer look than just the 5-year period. Demographic assumptions, your mortality, that's the big one, the rate of retirement. They take a shorter term look. And so they look at how far we've deviated from the experience, and then using their actuarial methods, they then place the assumption. So for instance, on the mortality assumption, they will analyze, we have a big enough data set from PERS that they do analyze our data and our mortality data, and then they choose the published mortality table that most closely fits where we are seeing the longevity of our members. It's historically, I don't know if this is interesting to anyone but me, but historically, Nevada public employees were lagging most mortality tables, in which means that our employees generally died earlier than you would see in most public employees. So we would have to customize the tables. We are seeing that not quite as much, and we don't have to customize the mortality tables quite as much anymore. So that's how they come to the mortality table. With the retirement rates, they look at who's retiring, when they're retiring, and then use that data to come up with an assumption. So it's really dependent on the assumption, how the actuary arrives at that. The economic assumptions they use, for instance, for the investment rate of return, they use projections from consultants, so a little bit more forward-looking. And inflation, they do a little bit that way as well. So that's kind of the high-level view from me on that. And if any more information as to the nuts and bolts of how to do that would probably need to come from the actuary who actually analyzes the data and recommends the assumptions to the board.
I agree that it's really interesting, and I would be interested in seeing kind of the nuts and bolts, but also how the board is working with the actuary to kind of address some of these anomalous issues that we've seen over the last couple of years. I don't know if there's a follow-up that we can get, but we work with staff or have staff work with you to see if we can follow up on some of that.
Absolutely, we'd be happy to.
Ms. Kasama, I believe you asked to be recognized next.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So this is my first meeting on the committee. So just a couple large picture questions as well. Just trying to understand from a timing standpoint. So do we have an actuarial valuation every June 30th? And then so next year we're going to set the contribution rates, and that will be effective for what calendar year, January 1st? Just wondering how the timing normally goes.
So the valuation that, so we essentially, the valuation is as of June 30, in this case, it would be 2022. The board does not receive it till about November because we have to cut the data as of June 30, and then the actuary needs a certain amount of time to work with the data. So in November, we received the valuation, November of 2022. And then if the actuarial rates deviate from the current statutory rates by more than 0.5% on the upside, then the statute requires the contribution rates be increased to equal the actuarial rate within rounded to the nearest 1/4, and that would be in effect July 1st of 2023. So the rates go into, so possible rate changes are come in July 1st of odd numbered calendar years. So they will be in effect, whatever they are, whether they don't change or they do change, they would be in effect for 2 years, and then the next look would be July 1st, 2025 under the current statutory mechanism.
And under the current statute, what you're saying, it can only go up 1/4 point per statute? Was it 1/4 point or 1/2 point?
No, excuse me. So if the actuarial, so if the rate the actuary has in the valuation is more than 0.5% over the statutory rate, the statutory rate will move all the way to the actuarial rate, whatever that is. But then whatever that is, you round to the nearest 1/4% so that we don't have odd numbers on the contribution rate. So there is no collar on that on the upside. There is a little bit on the downside, but it's just rounded to the nearest 1/4%.
Understand. So it moves up to the actuarial rate. Chair, may I follow up with?
Sure, go ahead.
And so, so obviously, I'm looking at this assumption here. We've got inflation at 2.75. It was reduced to 2.5. So all of that will be taken into account the next go around because we have inflation increasing. So I think based on what you said, all those assumptions will change. My other question was regarding the smoothing. So are you using just an average of the past 5 years? Are you using a rolling 5-year average? Particularly for investment gains, we've had a banner year, which is great, which helps the entire fund here. Yeah, I don't think we'll have that going on again this year. That would be nice, but I don't think so. So, is that a rolling 5-year average, just a straight 5-year average?
Tina List for the record. So what we do with that asset smoothing is we take the number that we have each year. So we had, say we had $1 million gain. So for this year, we would recognize 20% of that, which would be recognized with 20% of the gain or loss from the year prior, and the year prior, and the year prior, and the year prior. So you have 5 years, 20% of each of those gains or losses. So that you essentially you're averaging over the 5-year period. So for instance, in the valuation itself right now, we know what the gain or loss layer is for next year. So we have a combined number for 20% of the last 4 years. And then the next piece to put in is 20% of the gain of loss or loss in fiscal year 2022. And that's what will roll in. So it's essentially 20% of each of the previous 5 years.
That's an interesting way, but thank you.
Other questions from other committee members at this time before I ask my question? Ms. Peters?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to piggyback on that discussion on the smoothing. So I kind of got from your description that our investment return smoothing is 5 years, which has already started, and so the contribution smoothing would be 4 years. Is that to marry it up so that the smoothing would happen over the same period of time?
It's a similar amount of time, but the 4 years for the smoothing of the liability changes or the impact to the contribution rate of the liability changes for the assumption changes, that was recommended as a 4-year period by the actuary to match the periods between experience studies. So we potentially will change assumptions every 4 years. So they wanted to match the 4-year period to roll in the impact. So essentially, once we fully roll in the impact, that's when we will be doing another experience study. It just happens to be within a year of the assets. It also was recommended because of the asset smoothing to make it close, but they just did 4 years and then 5 years on the asset smoothing.
Okay, I think one of the concerns that I have is the folks who are involved during these smoothing periods, right? Because we have such a kind of transition period of employment right now at the state, that we have folks who would be involved in the first couple of years, and then more folks who would be involved in only the last couple of years. If hiring takes 2 years to get some of these positions filled. So I'm curious whether we've done an analysis on the impact to those individuals as they enter into the PERS system and exit the PERS system, and kind of the equity of that on folks who are invested.
Tina List for the record. We haven't done an analysis of that per se, other than we look at matching, the amortization period to working careers, more so for those that stay with the public employment, not as much for those moving in and out on the short term. And so to answer your question, no, we haven't done an analysis quite like that. But as I said, the board and the actuary are looking at a number of things, and we again are very interested in working. If the legislature has any ideas as the plan sponsor for equity issues as well on those issues.
Other questions? And along that same line, years ago, the in and out of state service wouldn't be quite as big a conversation. When you look at the graph that shows average length of service at 10 years, I find that very surprising. There's no longer that longer institutional knowledge at the state, and it seems to have the fiscal crisis before this last one did some damage, and we didn't really have a chance to recuperate from that. And then we ended up in the situation that we've been in the last couple of years. So it's been tough to be able to get the folks back. If you don't have state employees paying into the PERS system, you can't get the system fully funded. So I'm going to preempt the question because I know someone out there in the world is going to ask, if you have all these extra gains as they see them and you have a different term for it, the question from them will always be, why don't we just put it towards the unfunded liability and lower that 15 years down? So I think you've addressed it with the answering of your smoothing, but if you would directly answer that question, because we know that's going to come up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Tina List for the record. And certainly there are retirement systems that what you're suggesting is that we go to a full market value of assets to determine the funded ratio of the system, to determine contribution rates. And the caution that you would have going to a full market value of assets is that investment markets are very volatile. And it is a very good thing when you have an unrecognized gain. Asset smoothing is also a very good thing when you have losses. So the actuary will tell you that if you're going to smooth or not smooth, you have to do it on the upside and the downside. And so if someone were to, what you're suggesting again is going to market value of assets, which is fine. However, you have to be able to ride those time periods when you have large market losses. And you would have to ride those in a way where contributions could be extremely volatile and could shoot up and down with those markets. And so that would be the cautionary tale on that, is that it may very well happen that if we have a loss on the investments in the next year or two, that those unrecognized gains will get netted and they never roll in. But what also won't roll in is the loss that they got netted with. That's kind of just how we would answer that, is that it would make your contribution rates really rather volatile, and probably not in a way that would make it comfortable for your employees and your employers.
Thank you very much, Ms. Liz. I appreciate that. Is the lack of a roller coaster when it comes to this is a benefit to employees. They can plan, and a benefit to the state so that we can budget, knowing that there's going to be good years and bad years to try to smooth things out for folks. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. Are there any other questions from any other committee members on this particular item at this time? Oh, Peter, yes, I'm sorry. I just saw your hand. I apologize. Yeah. With a small phone screen, it's hard to see sometimes.
Yeah. So thank you, Ms. Liz, for the information that you provided. And the plan is in much better shape than it's been for probably decades. So I appreciate the work. And I think the smoothing is the right way to go, because we would have much more volatile rates. Kind of just circling back to the 4 years versus 5 years, because they're not matched up as far as the new approach when it comes to assumptions. In the memo that you sent us, it said usually those experience evaluations are every 4 to 6 years, and this time it happened to be 4. Do you anticipate that smoothing of those assumptions will change to 5 years if we go 5 years between analyses, or if the experience is over a 5-year period or a 6-year period versus the 4? Will that automatically kind of trigger it to be a different time period based on the analysis?
Tina List for the record. Yes, Senator. The 4-year period was what was recommended by the actuary based on the intervals between the last few experience studies. I think that that is also one of the things that the board will be looking at with the actuary over the course of this year or the time period between now and the next valuation, because it may be that it makes more sense to look at it from a 5 or a 6 year perspective if that's what we do for experience studies. I will note the best practices is generally 5 years, I believe, on experience studies. We have 4 to 6 years because we like to do the experience studies in non-rate setting years. So that's why we need to keep it on an even numbered cycle, either 4 or 6. And so that is certainly one of the things I think we'll be looking at is 4 year the right period. Could it be a 6 year period or a 5 year period to exactly match the asset smoothing? Again, that's just what they recommended for this go around for the valuation. And we will be looking at that scenario as well with the actuary before the next valuation.
Okay. I appreciate that. And I know the rates are high, and I think it's because we've been trying to catch up for so many years. And I think the smoothing is going to help with that because we did have this year with a huge return, but by smoothing it, if this year is not as great or the next year, it's going to help as far as making sure the contribution rates aren't up and down as much. We don't have that roller coaster. So thank you.
Any other questions from any other committee members at this time? I'm not seeing any. This is just a report, so I don't believe there's any action required on this particular item. So I believe we can move on to the next item, which is the report on the valuation of the judicial retirement system.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Tina Liss, Executive Officer of the Public Employees Retirement System. Item 4.3 in your packet, beginning on page 61, is an update on the fiscal year 2021 actuarial valuation for the judicial retirement system. Again, the board by policy conducts an annual actuarial valuation for the judicial retirement system. And like PERS, the rate setting mechanism is once every 2 years, making this a non-rate setting valuation for the judicial retirement system. The judicial retirement system covers both state judges and municipal judges and justices of the peace of those local jurisdictions who have opted to participate in the judicial retirement system. So if the local jurisdiction has opted not to participate in PERS or has never opted to participate in JRS, their judicial officials are still under PERS. Unlike PERS, JRS, or the judicial retirement system, is not a cost sharing plan, which means the state has its own costs and the local jurisdictions have their own costs based on their assets and their liabilities and their memberships. Pages 63 and 64 in your packet show demographic information for both state and non-state judges. Generally, the membership and the payroll in this fund is fairly stable, as these are only judgeship positions, and they tend to be filled when they're vacant, and they tend to have a statutory salary, so that we are able to predict fairly closely membership and payroll in this fund. Variations in membership and payroll generally will come about if you have a judicial retirement system judge replaced by a purge judge or vice versa. Page 65 shows benefit information for both state and non-state retirees. Just might notice on there that there was an increase of retirees from the state judges from 47 to 56 in the last fiscal year. Page 66 shows contribution requirements for the state judges. The state contribution rate is a percentage of payroll for normal costs and administrative expenses only. Because the system was recreated with an unfunded liability in 2001, because it took in all the judges who had not made contributions to PERS, it was a pay-as-you-go system. The state makes the unfunded liability payment as a lump sum amount once a year. So this page shows you both the percentage of payroll we get from the judges and also the lump sum payment that the state pays on the unfunded liability. I will note that there is an error on this page. The current statutory rate for the judges is 22.0%. I mean, yes, 22.0%, not 22.5%, which makes the contribution difference makes the contribution difference 0.89, not 0.39. We apologize for that error on that page. The amortization payment that was calculated for this fiscal year was $1,350,000. That's compared to $1,322,000 from the prior year valuation. So the contribution requirements for the state judges, if this were a rate setting year, would be pretty comparable with last valuation. And then page 67 shows the contribution requirements for the local jurisdiction judges in aggregate. The actuarial funded ratio of the judicial retirement system as a whole decreased from 94.4% to 92%. However, the funded ratio on a market value basis increased from 94% to 104.5%. The unfunded liability on an actuarial value of assets increased. However, the JRS has unrecognized gains of 21 million, which is larger than the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. So in other words, if this fund were to go to a market value basis, they would be in an overfunded situation and would not have an unfunded liability. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Committee members, any questions? I don't believe I see any from anyone on this item. So with that, I believe we can move to the next item, which is the report on the valuation of the legislators' retirement system.
Sorry, Tina List for the record. Item 4.4 in your packet, beginning on page 69, is an update on the fiscal year 2021 actuarial evaluation for the legislators' retirement system. Again, the even numbered fiscal year valuation for a legislators' retirement system determines the contributions of the state for this system. Since this is an odd numbered year valuation, this does not affect contribution rates. The provisions of the legislators' retirement system allows legislators to opt out of participation in the system. In 2021, we saw the active membership decrease from 32 members to 27 members. The number of retirees decreased from 56 to 55, while the overall number of beneficiaries, which includes survivors, decreased from 73 to 70. The funded ratio of this system on an actuarial basis increased from 95.9% to 98.8%. The funded ratio on a market value increased from 96.6% to 113.4%. The actuarial unfunded liability decreased from 199,000 to 61,000, and the effective amortization period is 0.9 years. Beginning on page 70 in your packet is demographic and funding information for the legislators' retirement system. On page 71, you might notice that the amortization payment that was calculated is actually larger than the entire actuarial unfunded liability. This is a function of how the layers for the amortization method works, and we will be working with our actuary to look at alternatives to that if next year the case is that the amortization payment exceeds the entire unfunded liability. And again, that's a function of the market value of assets having those unrecognized gains. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from any committee members on the legislative retirement issue? Not seeing any questions. All right, I believe we can move on to the next item, is number 6. One of my absolute favorites of all time is the report on the 1/5 year purchase service benefits for certain educational employees.
Yes, Madam Chair, that's one that I look forward to every year as well. But I was wondering,
it's never going away. It's going to be here until I'm on my way out. Hopefully you can fix it before you leave. So
and it's on its way out as well. But I was wondering if you wanted to do item 5 first, or if you wanted to go.
Oh, did I skip one? I apologize. Oh yes, item 5. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Steve Edmondson, our Chief Investment Officer, will present this.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Steve Edmondson, Chief Investment Officer of Nevada PERS. My report today includes an update on the status of the investment programs for PERS, legislators, and judicial funds. Beginning on page, I believe, 75 of your packet titled Investment Results, which summarizes investment returns for all three funds for various time periods through the 2021 fiscal year. The first column on the left depicts returns for the most recent fiscal year, which by any measure was an exceptional year for returns. PERS portfolio generated a 27.3% net of fee return, which represents PERS' second strongest fiscal year on record. PERS portfolio finished the year with $58.3 billion in assets, which was an $11.7 billion increase over the prior fiscal year. Over the last 37 years, PERS has generated a 9.6% average annual return net of all fees. Last fiscal year 2021, the Legislators Fund produced a return of 27.7% and ended the period with $5.7 million in assets, and the Judicial Fund finished the 2021 fiscal year with a 27.6% return and 178.6 million in assets as of June 30th. The following page, page 76, titled PERS Annual Performance, details PERS investment returns for each of the last 37 fiscal years. The horizontal line across the middle of the page depicts PERS long-term actuarial assumed rate of return, which was 7.5% through the 2021 fiscal year. However, as was noted earlier today, that was one of the assumptions that at the recommendation of PERS actuary was reduced again. On a going forward basis will be 7.25%. And it's always important to emphasize that that the long-term actuarial assumed rate of return is a long-term assumption, and that both our experience and expectations are that in any single year, we should expect returns to be both well and above and below that long-term number. Over the last 37 years, PERS has delivered a 9.6% net of fee return on average. However, in 11 of those years, the individual year return was well below that long-term objective. And I think that this pattern of individual years and midterm periods with returns both well above and below that long-term assumption should be expected going forward. The next few pages depict the same information for the legislators and judicial funds. And then moving on to page 79 of the packet, which details PERS investment strategy, which is in fact unique in the industry, in that we employ a much simpler approach with a larger allocation to high quality, publicly traded US stocks, and we own only US government treasury bonds in our fixed income allocation. To my knowledge, we are the only large public pension fund in the industry that utilizes 100% indexed management across all of our publicly traded asset classes. In addition to that, we deliberately avoid more complicated and often expensive investment strategies such as the utilization of leverage or hedge funds. One of the byproducts of our simple low-cost or simple approach is that we are one of, if not the lowest cost large public pension funds out there in terms of investment management fees. PERS investment management fees on an annual basis, we save approximately $241 million a year relative to a comparable sized large public pension fund and their more complex structures. In addition to being low cost, PERS simple approach has produced returns that have been competitive relative to the industry over the years. Over the last 3, 5, 7, 10, and 20-year time periods, PERS returns rank within the top 20 or 15th percentile or better of large public pension funds, and for a number of those periods, well within the top decile of other large public funds. We certainly don't expect to be in the top of the database each and every year. However, we remain confident that PER's simple low-cost approach will remain competitive over longer time periods. Now, while my report today provides an update through the most recent fiscal year end, I wanted to take an opportunity to provide a quick update on performance through today in the 2022 fiscal year. As of this afternoon, PER's portfolio is up approximately 4% with right around $60 billion in assets. However, given the low level of interest rates, the fact that the market is now seeing a removal of some of the fiscal and monetary accommodation that has flooded the system with liquidity over the last couple of years, it wouldn't be surprising to see returns moderate over the next few years in the midterm period. But with that, that concludes my prepared remarks, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. With that, Ms. Peters, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that last bit about where we are so far this year in the financial markets. I was wondering what that impact looked like to PERS, but it is kind of heartening to know that we have a pretty good investment strategy that looks to be a little less volatile than I was expecting, given the turn in the market. So if there's any additional information you want to share about where we are, I would appreciate that. If you want to stand with what you said, that's also great. But just really curious about how we're standing today.
Sure, yes. Again, Steve Edmondson for the record. It has definitely been I guess, a volatile start to the current calendar year. Through the December quarter, PERS was up 7.4%. As we sit here today, we're up 4%. And I think that's just a good kind of a touchstone as to the type of volatility that we can expect in any single year. It's been a relatively good start to a fiscal year, especially coming off a period of extraordinarily strong returns. It's not only been a great single year, last fiscal year up 27.3%, but the last decade PERS portfolio is up 10% annualized. And what we've witnessed over time is that, after periods of extraordinarily strong returns, they're often followed by periods of returns that are a little bit more muted. So for instance, if the portfolio over the next 10 years delivered an annualized return of say 5%, that would average out over a 20-year time period to be 7.5%. So it's one of those things that we really need to take heart that in any single year. And as we look out over the next few months, we're sitting here at 4%. Where we end the fiscal year is anyone's guess, but I think that we can continue to be confident that if we truly embrace a longer time horizon, that we can ultimately achieve our goals.
Thank you. Senator Brooks, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. My question was kind of around the investment strategy. And I know that you had mentioned that it's so 100% indexed right now, and that's kind of been why we've been able to keep our fees low and have a very small and lean shop. Is there any plan or discussion about perhaps fund-to-fund investments in private equity or hedge and anything, even a percentage of the portfolio?
Yes, Steve Edmondson for the record. We don't have any current plans to alter, I guess, the simpler approach that we've been employing here at PERS. It's proven to be highly successful. We have nearly 4 decades of experience at this point, and there will definitely be time periods where we're at the bottom of the database. We've experienced that about a third of the time. There'll be time periods where the volatility stings the portfolio a bit, but we do remain confident that PER's simple approach will continue to produce competitive returns over time. However, with that said, The piece of PERS investment program that's fully indexed are the public market pieces. So US stocks, international stocks, and our fixed income portfolios are all indexed. And we think that that strategy remains sound. That's where the bulk of our cost savings comes from. And quite frankly, the evidence suggests that this approach is a good one. However, that isn't the entirety of PERS investment program. We do have a 12% dedicated target to private market assets, 6% in private real estate, and a 6% target allocation to private equity. That private equity piece, although it's not a fund of funds like you had suggested, it's similar in that it can almost be considered to be a separate account fund of funds, in that we have a fully discretionary manager that manages that portfolio, and underneath that umbrella are in excess of 200 individual private equity partnerships. We have a long track record of success with this program. It's grown over time. It used to be, when I started here, it was around 1% of PERS total fund assets. Today, we have a target of 6% of total fund assets. It's actually running a little bit above that because returns last year in the private markets were so strong. The private equity portfolio was up 67% last fiscal year. So we're a little bit above target. PERS private real estate portfolio is a little bit different. It's much more conservative than I would say the typical public pension fund, in that our private real estate portfolio does not utilize leverage. It consists entirely of unlevered core assets, and it's been incredibly competitive relative to some other programs that have a lot more risk in them. So I think that we're going to continue to stick with these approaches, and whether or not they get expanded at some point into the future on the private market side, that's something that we're always considering. And in fact, we're looking at and reviewing our asset allocation here this spring in March and April. I don't anticipate any dramatic changes to the structure, but we're often kind of held out as a simple fund because we are 100% indexed. However, we do in fact have that 12% target allocation to those private assets, including private equity.
Thank you.
Ms. Kasama, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. On page 85 of our exhibit, I was just looking at the investment managers and fees. And my question there, could you, I have two points actually. One, it would be great, I think, if we could just add columns in, for example, the asset size by each fund manager. It'd be nice to have a percentage column so it's easy to see, you know, this fund manager is handling 8%, and this one 15%. And the fees, likewise, perhaps we could have a column with just percentage, so it's a percentage of the fees to the asset managed. But could you just kind of explain, you know, for example, I'm looking at A and B, it's a 12.901 million with fees of 682,000, and then right below that we have AEW Realty 1.292 million with 4.6 million in fees. Can you help explain how that works?
Yes, absolutely. And again, Steve Edmondson for the record. And first of all, we'll absolutely include those additional columns on page 85 of the report going forward. That's definitely something that we can do. However, in regard to kind of I think the obvious thing that jumps off the page here is you look at the size of those portfolios and then the fees associated with them. For instance, the AB portfolio at the top of the page that you referenced, that's an S&P 500 index mandate, which has extraordinarily low fees. So the fees on that portfolio are less than 1/2 of a basis point. And so even though it's this large portfolio, $12 billion in assets, on an annual basis, it only costs us $682,000 to access that market. And that's a byproduct of, again, of those indexed portfolios. So across the board, our index mandates, you're going to see very low fees associated with them. And that's one of the reasons why we do it. our Nevada PERS fees are approximately 40 basis points below the median fund investment fees. So we always kind of, the way that we see it is we start each fiscal year off with a 40 basis point fee advantage over the median fund, and that's proven to be pretty accurate over the years. Those larger fees.
Pathway Capital Management, you've got 47 million to 4.278 million.
Yes. And so those private market portfolios are the ones that I was just talking about before on the earlier question, the private real estate mandates, which are AEW on this page and Invesco Real Estate. And then there are the large fees associated with the Pathway Capital portfolio, which is the private equity mandate. Private equity fees are one of those things that it's the most high fee asset class out there. It's something that we've scrutinized again and again over the years and have been reluctant to, I guess, increase our allocation to the asset class largely, or not the least of which is due to the fact that the asset class has much higher fees. It's important to note that private equity, included in those private equity fees, are the fees for all the underlying general partnerships within the portfolio. Private equity fees are one of those things that are reported differently across all funds. Some funds will only report a portion of them. We like to include, for the purpose of just simply transparency, we try to include all the fees associated with those private equity mandates, including the underlying general partner fees. So the fees,
which we should.
So the fees are very high. Well, it's a hot industry debate as to what actually does constitute a fee in private equity, because returns for private equity are always reported net of all fees. We don't cut a check for each one of those fees that are noted. Those are fees that are netted out of the distributions that are returned to Nevada PERS in terms of the distributions that we receive out of the partnerships. So we don't actually get an invoice for those fees, but we do account for them, the fact that those fees are retained by the general partner and are not just ultimately distributed back to us.
Correct.
And it's one of those things that private equity particularly has proven to provide a couple of benefits despite the large fees. It's something that we take really seriously here. We want to remain the lowest cost public pension fund out there. However, if there's an opportunity for us to include something in the portfolio that will still be accretive, both on a return basis and also provide some diversification benefits, despite those costs, we will include it in the portfolio, even though we have this propensity to keep our fees as low as possible. And private equity is an asset class that over the years has proven to deliver a premium above and beyond what public markets have delivered, and has also provided some additional diversification benefits to the fund. And so
I don't mind fees being higher when the returns are higher. And maybe what might be helpful too is to even add one more column where we have maybe the 5-year average of returns from those funds. That'd just be a quick little cheat sheet here on 85. We could, see the percentage of which group, what their portion of the asset management is, what the percentage of fees is to their asset base, and then perhaps one more column with just what are the returns we've been getting for them, because that's fine. If fees are higher and they give me more, that's okay. But I think if we could have just kind of a snapshot of that, I think it would make it easier for us to understand.
Yes, that's absolutely something that we can include. And to your point, so for instance, last fiscal year, U.S. stocks were up around 40%. However, the private equity portfolio was up over 67%, net of all those fees. So last year was one of those years where, the fees out of that portfolio were higher, but we'll certainly happily take the net of fee premium at the end of the day. But it's important, to kind of hold all these and I think carefully scrutinize, especially the expensive asset classes, because we want to be sure that we are getting our money's worth. So we'll absolutely include that on a going forward basis.
Thank you. I appreciate your indulgence. Thank you, Chair.
There are questions from other committee members at this time. Senator Orangeau.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Edmondson, thank you for your presentation. Two questions, if you'll indulge me, Madam Chair. And I, being new to this committee, maybe these have been answered before, but one, looking at the investments on page 85, does PERS invest? We're talking about speculative investments, and I appreciate the conservative approach, but does PERS have any investments in cryptocurrency? That's my first question. And if so, how do you kind of temper the speculativeness of that? And then, hearing so many of the talking heads talk about a possible contraction that might be coming, I just wonder, how is PERS trying to prepare for that if that is on the horizon?
Yes, thank you for that question. Again, Steve Edmondson, Chief Investment Officer, Nevada PERS. To address the first question, we do not have any direct investments in cryptocurrency. We don't own any Bitcoin in the portfolio. And at this point, it's an asset class that has not been widely adopted by large-scale institutional managers. I have only heard of one other large public pension fund that has even begun to include any direct exposure to cryptocurrencies in their portfolio. I think it's one of those things that we don't anticipate will play a meaningful role in PERS portfolio, at least in the near term. It's at this point, I think it's fair to say, remains purely a speculative asset class. But we'll see how it evolves over the years. However, with that said, we did have a small exposure in our private equity portfolio to a related company called Coinbase that went public, and that operates as an exchange in the cryptocurrency markets. And so there was some small exposure within our private equity portfolio, but we do not have any direct exposure to crypto in the portfolio, and don't plan on including it anywhere in the near term. In regard to potentially protecting the portfolio for a downturn in the markets, that's one of the things that is always in the back of our head. We certainly don't know when downturns will happen, and we don't know how deep they will be. However, we do know that they will happen. And in order to combat that or help offset that, PERS portfolio is broadly diversified across asset classes, owning both high quality US stocks and developed market international stocks. But to offset some of the volatility that's associated with, I guess, growth assets, or you could call them risk assets, stocks and equity in our portfolio, we do have a large allocation to treasury bonds. So our fixed income allocation is somewhat unique in the industry in that it's entirely consists of US government treasury securities. There is no credit in that portfolio. So we've specifically removed all the equity linked risk out of our fixed income portfolio. So it acts as a pure diversifier when equity markets do turn down. Now, with just over 70% of our portfolio in what you could, I guess, characterize as being kind of risky growth assets, meaning stocks and equity and private real estate, we do have a larger allocation to those diversifying assets and treasury bonds than the median fund. So on one end, we have more kind of high quality US stocks on one side, and then to mute the impact of downturns, we have a whole bunch of treasury bonds on the other side. However, with that said, when market downturns do occur, there's only so much that we can do to protect the portfolio. We will experience the ride along with markets, but we do the best that we possibly can to smooth it out as the years go by.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edmondson. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome, Senator. So with that, committee members, are there any other questions at this time? Seeing none. Okay, thank you very much. I believe now we can actually go to the next item. I jumped the gun a bit to item number 6.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Tina List, Executive Officer of the Retirement System. Item 4.6 in your packet, beginning on page 87, is an update on the benefit provided to certain education employees pursuant to NRS 391.165. This benefit was designed to be an incentive to certain employees to work at schools that have been designated as needs, or at least 65% of the pupils who are children at risk. Additionally, any teacher who holds an endorsement in mathematics, science, special education, or English as a second language meets all the eligibility requirements and have been employed for at least 1 year of area endorsement may also be entitled to that benefit. Section 4 of Assembly Bill 1 of the 23rd Special Session, AB 1, repealed the benefit effective July 1st, 2007, and phases it out over time. If an employee elected to continue in this program, the participation ceases when the employee has received, after his election, 1 full year of service credit pursuant to that program. So at a fifth of a year, that would be 5 years of participation in the program. And so, as you can tell from the math there, that teachers and educational employees go in and out of the program. We do have some employees who are still eligible for this benefit. The spreadsheet on page 89 reflects the purchases for calendar years 20 and 21. In calendar year 20, the system received $470,253 for 81 purchases. In calendar year 2021, it was $266,965 for 44 purchases. Since inception, we have received about $148 million for over 41,000 purchases. So as you can see, this benefit is phasing out slowly, but we do have the few stragglers, and when each of them have had their full year purchased, then this program will be gone. I'd be happy to answer any questions on this program.
Any questions from any committee members on this? The only thing I have to say is please don't ever do this again.
Yes, I concur.
Thank you. We don't agree on much, but that one we got. Okay. So with that, I don't see any other questions, so we can move on to number 7, I believe.
Yes. Madam Chair, Tina Listigan, Executive Officer of PERS. Item 4.7, beginning on page 91 of your packet, is a memorandum outlining the PERS current reemployment restrictions and the critical labor shortage exemption from these reemployment restrictions. Also included with the memo pursuant to NRS 286-523 subsection 6 is a report on the compilation of the forms received from each designating authority that has designated a position as a critical need position effective during the biennium period July 1st, 2019 to June 30, 2021. Assembly Bill 488 in the 2009 legislative session significantly restricted the use of critical labor shortage exemption from the PERS reemployment exemptions. Generally, PERS retiree has restrictions from becoming reemployed with a public employer, and the critical labor shortage exemption provides an avenue to hire retirees without running afoul of those reemployment provisions. But to do so, the legislation in 2009 requires a declaration of the critical need of the position, and it needs to be extreme need. It requires the employers who seek declaration of positions of critical need make the determination based upon the appropriate necessary delivery of services to the public. It requires employers to hold a hearing in an open public meeting and make findings to support the critical needs designation. The employer must file a report with the system as to the findings, and the system must then prepare a report for this committee on a biennial basis. The critical labor shortage provisions were set to sunset June 30, 2015. Senate Bill 406 of the 2015 legislative session removed the sunset for these provisions and made these provisions a permanent feature of the plan. Effective for the period July 1st, 2019 to June 30, 2021, 156 positions were declared as critical needs by 48 employers, including 6 positions designated by the state, 91 positions designated by charter school districts and charter schools, 8 positions designated by counties, 47 positions designated by hospitals, 2 positions by cities, and 2 positions by fire protection districts. These designations are valid for 2 years and then must be redesignated to remain in effect. The declaration of critical need is position-driven, not individual-specific. Therefore, one position designation, for instance, a special education teacher at a particular school district, may have a number of employees hired under that designation. Also, the fact that a position has been designated, it does not necessarily mean at this moment it is filled with a retiree. Starting on page 94 is a listing of all positions designated as critical needs effective during the period of the report, along with the original date of designation. I will note that this biennium, there were quite a few more positions designated than the previous biennium. It appears to be mainly in the hospital area, which makes sense given the last 2-year period that we have been in. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
So with that, Ms. Lees, I think it would be important for you to go ahead. You said something that I think a lot of folks glance over. Position isn't necessarily a person. Position is more the classification, and there could be multiple employees within that position. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. The reasoning behind the designation is that you have a critical position that you cannot fill, and that's why it's position driven. So I use the example of a special education teacher because that I know historically sometimes can be hard to fill. So for instance, if Clark County School District designates special education teacher, there could be, that's one designation, but you might have 15 employees across the district that are employed under that one designation.
And in looking at the charts on 94, 95, just glancing at it, I see a lot of date designated going back 12 years to 2010. So when we talk about filling positions and the critical, I always call it critical fill. This isn't something new as far as this particular school district goes. It's been going on for over a decade.
Correct. I think a lot of these positions have been continually redesignated every 2 years, and that is up to the appointing authority. In this case, it'd be the school board. And so PERS has no involvement in that designation. That is obviously at the employer level where they know their needs. But yes, I think you will see historically, particularly in the education arena, that there have been certain positions that have been essentially designated critical needs from the beginning, which I think the original critical labor shortage legislation was in the early 2000s.
Thank you very much for clarifying those components. Questions from any committee members at this time? Not seeing any. Thank you very much, Ms. Lees. I believe we can go on to our next item, please. Number 8.
Hello, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Rick Combs, C-O-M-B-S. It's good to see many of you that I know from the past, and nice to meet those of you who weren't legislators when I was with the legislature myself. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about the Retirement Benefits Investment Fund. This is item 8, which are the information is included in pages 101 through 106 in your meeting packet. The Retirement Benefits Investment Fund was created by the 2007 legislature through the enactment of SB 457. The bill was requested by the Committee on Local Government Finance to address 2 primary issues. The first being GASB 45 included a requirement that in order to offset liabilities for other post-retirement benefits, the assets to pay those liabilities needed to be deposited in an irrevocable trust fund. And so the first thing they wanted to do was authorize local governments to be able to create those trust funds. Secondly, local governments in Nevada are constitutionally restricted in the manner in which they can invest funds. And the Committee on Local Government Finance wanted to create a mechanism that would allow for these trust funds to be set aside in more long-term type investments. The SB 457, as it was enacted, didn't create the authority for the local governments to create these OPEB trust funds. Each trust fund has to have a board of trustees that's appointed by the governing body of the local government. The board of trustees acts in a fiduciary capacity. The bill also created the Retirement Benefits Investment Fund, which pursuant to statute really serves as a pooled investment vehicle for the OPEB trusts. The trusts are not required to pool their assets in this fund, but they are authorized to do so if those board of trustees acting in their fiduciary capacity believe that's in the best interests of the beneficiaries. SB 457 created a retirement benefits investment board to manage RBIF, and it does not act as a fiduciary with respect to the money that's contributed to the fund. The Retirement Benefits Investment Board consists of the same members of the PERS board, but it is a separate legal entity and has separately agendized meetings. It's authorized to employ such staff and contract for services as deemed necessary to administer the fund and to charge administrative costs to the fund. From the fund's inception in 2008 until 2020, the PERS staff provided all of this administrative support for the fund. In October of 2020, the board approved a contract for administration, and that's why I'm here before you today. And the PERS staff still provides the investment, the legal, and the accounting services for the board. From a performance standpoint, as of the end of FY 2021, the balance in the fund was $773.8 million. The return for FY 2021, very consistent with the other funds that Steve talked to you about, returned 27.5%. And the return since inception, so since 2008, in the fund has been 7.9%. The funds required to be managed in the same manner as the PERS investment program, due to the much smaller size of the RBIF assets compared to the PERS assets. There are some differences in the structure between the funds, but the policy risk allocation is identical. And this is demonstrated by the fact that over the past 10 years, the returns in the investment fund is within 0.2% of the PERS returns. The table that's provided on page 103 of your packet reflects the market value of each of the participating OPEB trusts as of June 30th, 2021. There are now 12 OPEB trusts that are participating, and that's down from basically down from 13. They're all at this point now local governments. The Public Employees Benefits Program did withdraw the last amount of money that was in the RBIF for their liabilities. They withdrew that this past year. With that, Madam Chair, I'd be glad to stand for any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Combs. It's nice to hear your voice again. Hope you're doing well. There's a couple times last session I almost called you, but I didn't. So welcome. So with that, committee members, do you have any questions of Mr. Combs? Ms. Kasama, Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to understand for this fund. So this fund, it not being combined with PERS is strictly to comply with the GASB requirements. Is that correct? The GASB. So this is just a requirement for accounting for state governments that this had to be a separate fund, and that's why you couldn't have it combined with PERS, because you're kind of mirroring PERS from what I understand.
Yeah, I think the primary, when the bill was originally introduced, it did actually combine it with PERS. That was the original design. But as you can imagine, PERS had some pretty big concerns with that from the standpoint of only having PERS people working on PERS, PERS money, and there being that fiduciary responsibility that the PERS board had towards PERS. And so ultimately, when the bill was enacted, it was amended to create a separate fund. And so there is no sub accounts or anything like that. It is two separate funds managed by two separate boards. And again, that's although the board membership is the same, the boards, they are in fact separate legal entities.
And is this mainly done to comply with GASB requirements?
Well, you could probably have complied with GASB without creating the trust fund. But what the creation of the trust fund allowed was for the various local governments to pool their investments in the liabilities that they were going to face for these other post-employment benefits, and to achieve and to be able to achieve better returns, because they were able then to invest in long-term investments rather than what the investments that local governments are typically limited to.
I see. So it's a vehicle for the locals to invest on a state program for economies of scale.
Correct.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome for the follow-up, Assemblywoman Kasama. So the next question was from Senator Ganser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I'm looking at the balances in the fund, when you look at, for instance, like Washoe County and Tahoe Douglas fire protection, it's significantly higher than Clark County or the city of Las Vegas. And I know the funds aren't required to be put in, but it's not required to be put into this fund. So what do those municipalities do? Because I would imagine they've got outstanding liabilities outside of retirement, because this is all about benefits outside of retirement.
Correct. These are primarily for health benefits for retirees, and each of the local governments have their own methods that they use to try to offset those liabilities, and they can choose not to offset those liabilities, quite frankly, as well. So each of them are making their own separate decisions as to, first of all, how much they set aside for those liabilities, and then secondarily, whether or not they choose to use the retirement benefits investment fund for all of the money that they have set aside, part of the money they have set aside, or they don't participate at all. That is up to each of those local government entities to decide.
As a follow-up, if they're not participating in this, and you just mentioned they have a choice whether, because when you look at PERS, that's a property right, but health insurance is not a property right, is my understanding. And so the obligation is different. So if they don't create a fund for it, then do they still comply with GASB, or does GASB apply to also PEB like it does PERS? Can it in this write-up, it sort of suggests that it does, but I'm not sure if it does or not.
Yes, GASB does have some applicability, but I don't want to, Senator Severs-Gansert, I don't want to suggest to you that I'm an expert on GASB. Clearly, I am not. But GASB statements 43 and 45 did relate to these other post-employment benefits that government entities have on their books. And they're really reporting issues, though, about how you report those liabilities. And in this case, what these trust funds allow the local government to do is they have to report the liability on their financial statements, This allowed them to be able to offset those liabilities by showing that, yes, we also have this trust fund over here, this OPEB trust fund that has money set aside to offset those liabilities. If a particular government agency didn't have anything set aside, then they obviously just wouldn't report any offset to those liabilities that were on their books.
Okay, and then all the entities, I'm trying to remember the name of it, is it CAFR, that they have annual reports where they have to disclose this information? Is that right? So if I were to look at Clark County, I'd see what they reported on an annual basis as far as their liability, and if they have any trusts like this is, like other than this one that's set up.
That's my understanding, Senator.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions from other committee members at this time? Not seeing any, I believe we can go ahead and move on to the next item then, which would be number 9, the status report on the implementation of the pension administration system.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. For the record, Cabrina Fazer, Operations Officer for the Public Employees Retirement System of Nevada. Item 9, starting on page 107, provides an update on the status of the new pension administration system. Work began with the vendor, Tegrit Software Ventures, on February 22nd, 2021. There was an in-person project kickoff with the vendor and staff on July 13th of 2021. There are 7 phases to the project, and phase 1, project initiation and startup, phase 2, infrastructure and project prep, and phase 3.1, web-based employer reporting requirements are completed. An employer advisory group has been established. This has been a beneficial resource for communication and collaboration. We have monthly meetings and try to provide the employer advisory group with any process changes. They've looked at our sample formatting and utilized them as a resource for any communications to liaison officers and employer representatives. In addition to that, data cleansing efforts have been ongoing since 2019, with approximately 93% of our data is ready for our first deployment to the new system. I'm happy to answer any questions regarding the pension administration system project.
Thank you very much. It's nice to hear one that is going as we planned. Thank you. So with that, other members of the committee, Assemblywoman Peters.
Thank you, Chair. I am curious about the status of the development for phase 3. I think I heard you just say that it was completed, but looking at my notes and the packet, it looks like it's due to be completed in, August of this year. So can you give us an update on what parts of phase 3 have been completed and if we're looking at being on target for that deadline?
Yes, I can. So phase 3 was actually split into 2 parts. There's 3.1, which was the requirements. So that's where staff met with the vendor in order to develop what was needed in order for them to design before we went live with the employer reporting processes with all of the employer groups. And so that is the piece that is completed. We are actually phase 3.2 is the file-based reporting, which is due in June, but we are actually on track to complete early. And so we have been working with the vendor and getting really close to getting all of that. We just started our user acceptance testing. And so staff will be working on all of that before we have additional meetings with employer representatives and provide them with the finalized format.
Ms. Peters, anything else?
No, that was it for me.
You're welcome. Any other member of the committee, any questions on this item? Trying to scan the gallery, not seeing any. All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate the presentation. So with that, I believe that concludes item number 4 on all the items under the PERS system. I believe we can go to item number 5, discussing the Public Employees Benefits Program. So we'll give folks a moment to switch up here. And I believe we have Ms. Rich. Are you going to be the lead on this one?
I will.
Good afternoon, Ms. Rich. If you'd like to go ahead and proceed, we'll do item number 1, the overall presentation on PEB.
Sure. So good afternoon, Chair Carlton and members of the committee. I am Laura Rich, Executive Officer of the Public Employees Benefits Program. Today with me, I have Carrie Eaton, who is PEB's Chief Financial Officer, as well as 2 representatives from Aon, PEB's Actuarial Consulting Service. So I realize that the committee has been provided a whole lot of reports containing a plethora of information. So I put together a presentation that recaps some of the more important items from each of the reports. Ms. Eaton will be manning the presentation while I go through each of the agenda items one by one, and then I'll stop in between for questions if that works for the committee.
And before you proceed, Ms. Rich, just to let everyone know that we won't need to discuss item number 2. That was put on the agenda. Those items were not available to us right now. So that's not ready to be discussed today. So we'll be doing items 1, 3, 4, and 5, if I understand correctly. So please proceed.
Okay. All right. So this isn't part of the reports, but since there are several new members on the committee, I thought it would be good just to provide some very a high level snapshot of PEB. First of all, we cover active state employees, their retirees and their dependents, as well as non-state actives and retirees. So when we use the term non-state, we're referring to groups such as local governments and school districts, et cetera, and also their dependents as well. So PEB provides members with health insurance benefits, including medical, vision, dental, and then other ancillary benefits such as basic life insurance. We also include a multitude of voluntary benefits as well. So we are funded using 2 mechanisms. The first is a legislatively approved subsidy. This is determined during PEB's budget hearing during legislative session. And that subsidy amount is the portion that the employer picks up. So in that case, the state. Typically for employee-only coverage, that subsidy covers about anywhere between 92 to 96% of the total premium, depending on the plan year. The remainder of that is what the employee pays, and it is what turns out to be their monthly premium. Although PEB doesn't receive general fund dollars, agencies who are funded using general fund dollars pay the subsidy to PEB for each employee with their agency. And then also, because retirees are offered insurance benefits as well, agencies also pay a percentage of payroll to fund the retiree benefits. Next slide. So PEB offers several plans. The majority of our plans are self-funded. We have a consumer-driven high deductible plan, which is offered statewide. We have an exclusive provider organization plan, which is the EPO, that's offered in the north, and a low deductible plan, which is offered statewide. That is new for this plan year, the current one we are in today. We also offer a fully insured plan. It's an HMO in the south, and it is offered by Health Plan of Nevada. For our Medicare retirees, we offer a Medicare exchange that is available for those Medicare retirees to purchase their Medicare plans through and enroll in their Medicare plans. We also provide an HRA for those Medicare retirees based on years of service as well. So the first agenda item is a presentation on upcoming changes that were adopted by the board for plan year 23. It is basically just kind of a synopsis of moving forward where PEB is heading. The first one is employer mandated COVID-19 testing. So previously, DHHS was administering the employee testing program and paying for it using CRF funding. That function has now been transitioned to PEB. as well as the funding will transition to PEP effective February 2022, this month. Some information and notices went out actually yesterday on this, and so this is now up and running and ready to kick off on February 21st. So although the OSHA mandate was struck down by the Supreme Court, the state is going to continue to enforce a similar testing policy. So this is regardless of the OSHA mandate. This is specifically just for the state, and it's a state policy. Previously, there was a 70% threshold where if you worked in a building or in a state office that was over 70% vaccinated, those employees who were unvaccinated did not have to test. They were exempt from testing. That it has now gone away and is no longer in effect. So 100% of unvaccinated employees will be subject to testing. The cost, based on the data that was available back in December when the PEB board met and discussed and approved this option, is based on the number of employees who are unvaccinated and the number that we have available. It's estimated to be about 6,000 state employees, and looking at that number, using that number, we're looking at about $18.5 million cost per year for testing. PEB will be recouping these costs through COVID premium surcharges beginning in July of 2022. So effective February 21st, as I said, PEB will be administering rapid antigen tests to all agencies for distribution to employees. There have been some agencies who have selected to direct mail these tests to their employees to their homes instead of distributing them in-house. Those tests are proctored through a telemedicine provider, and then results are logged so that the state can then follow up on who has tested and which employees are subject to testing. So next slide. So a little bit on the COVID surcharges. The COVID surcharges were meant to recoup costs, not just for the weekly testing of unvaccinated employees. It's also meant to recoup the costs associated with higher testing and treatment costs associated with unvaccinated members. Additionally, hospitalization as well. This was modeled under similar to a tobacco surcharge, which has been deemed legal and appropriate, and through other insurers have been using this for years now. So, but it is still subject to the ACA affordability rules. Because of that, the surcharges were capped for the employees, state employees, but were not capped for dependents. So those state employees, the surcharge will be $50 to $55 a month per unvaccinated employee, and then $175 a month for unvaccinated dependent over 18. The surcharges, as I said, begin on July 1st of 2022, and PEB will be working with the governor's office to establish a medical and religious exemption process, and we will have that in place by the time that this is well in advance of the surcharges beginning on July 1st. Next slide. So plan benefit design restoration.
Ms. Rich, I'm going to stop you right there. I think we should address this first one, and then we'll move to plan design. Each one of these is a little complicated. So as far as if you could go back to the screen, I'd appreciate it to remind me. Does the state currently do the tobacco surcharge? I'm not familiar with it.
Well, Rich, for the record, we do not impose a tobacco surcharge. There are plenty of insurers out there who do, but PEB does not.
So even though we don't apply a tobacco surcharge, you're citing that as the basis for the vaccine surcharge.
Correct. It was the legality of this is based on basically it's similar to a tobacco surcharge. And so those insurers who have imposed similar surcharges to what PEB is doing, it's been deemed kind of the predecessor of these COVID surcharges and what the COVID surcharges are modeled under.
Do you plan on ever implementing a tobacco surcharge? Because to me, that's a much bigger problem in long term and probably a much higher cost. So is the board contemplating a tobacco surcharge in the future?
Laura Rich, for the record, the board has not contemplated a tobacco surcharge. It does not mean that it is something that we can't do in the future. Definitely something that we can explore moving forward, but it has not come up. No.
And it's my recollection that most of the time the board has taken the wellness tact of rewarding folks for doing better rather than penalizing them. So this particular surcharge is a distinct departure from our wellness attitude in the past, whereas we're doing something punitive for an action rather than rewarding an action.
Correct. But I do have to say that the circumstances are slightly different because of the fact that it is the funding has to be there, right? So in order to cover the funding of testing, the cost of testing, PEB doesn't have those dollars budgeted. And so the funding had to come in from somewhere in order to cover that cost of employee testing for unvaccinated members, in addition to obviously some of these higher costs that we're seeing, through hospitalization and, and treatment for COVID of unvaccinated members. So it is a departure from the wellness approach in the past, but it's a different situation because of the funding aspect of this.
So the free tests that are being mailed to folks and that can be accessed in different places are not going to be utilized. It would have to be a separate test that you proctor, correct?
That is correct. Okay. I would also like to just clarify that PEB is still paying for those free tests, those 8 tests that are free to members are not free to the plan. And so we still, as an insurer, still pay for those 8 tests that each member is eligible to receive every month.
But there will be no surcharge on those.
Correct. That was something that was, Laura Rich, for the record, that was something that the Biden administration basically put on, rules that the Biden administration put on health insurance group plans. And so there's a process that we're working out. And I think not just PEB, but nationally insurers are trying to work out that process as to how can we facilitate this benefit for members in order for them to receive these free over-the-counter tests. But this is definitely different. The employee testing is for employer purposes. And because of that, it needs to be proctored. And so this is part of that testing includes a proctoring option.
Well, thank you. I'll go ahead and open it up to other members. Those are questions that have been posed to me by a number of different folks. And with the change in the environment over the last couple of months, since we previously discussed this, those are things that I thought it was really important for us to get on the record moving forward, because I'm getting emails from state employees hearing all different types of things. So I thought it would be best if I got the answer from you on the record for them so that it was made available to them. So other committee members, do you have any other questions on that particular portion of the presentation? Assemblywoman Kasama?
Thank you, Chair. 18.5 million is a lot of money for this, and I understand the importance too. And the numbers have been changing, and we hopefully see further declines as we go along here. My question is, so since it was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, who is making the decision? Is this your department that is making the decision that you're going to still require mandatory testing? Is that from the governor's office? How does this flow of who is making the decision that this is still something we're going to require here?
So Laura Rich, for the record, this is a governor's policy. And so we've been working with the governor's office to ensure, to coordinate, to ensure that this policy can be carried out, not just by PEB, but by DHHS and other agencies as well.
Thank you.
Other committee members, Senator Orangel.
Thank you very much, Chair Carlton. My question as to the surcharge, you mentioned that it was primarily just for the state or for PEB to be even with testing for the unvaccinated employees who participate in PEB. Why the 3 times higher fee for the dependent over 18? I just wonder what's the rationale for that being so much higher?
Laura Rich, for the record. So we had to figure out a mechanism to bring in sufficient funding to cover the approximate $18.5 million. Because of the affordability rules in the ACA, you can only impose a certain, there's a top to what you can assess in terms of for the employee only, right? And so the total premium has to be deemed affordable, and there's a whole lot that goes into it. There's, you use federal poverty levels and minimum wage and things like that to determine all that. And so in order to remain under those affordability levels, it had to be capped at $55 per employee. Now, there's no affordability rule for dependents. And so the $175 comes from essentially the remainder of that 18.5 million that we need to collect in order to be made whole.
Thank you. And then just so I can be clear, that there's no surcharge for a dependent under 18 who's unvaccinated?
Correct.
Thank you, Administrator Rich. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So Ms. Rich, I need to backtrack on that logic because the person who ends up paying it is the state employee. So in essence, they're still paying for that test. So I guess it just seems a little backwards to me that we're trying to deal with an affordability threshold, changing the rate, but yet the person who ends up paying for it is the state employee anyway.
So, Laura Rich, for the record, this gets even more complicated, Chair Carlton. So employees, let's say that we charged employees for a test. And so they had to go to a certain testing facility and they got charged week over week, those who were subject to testing. So at the beginning of the pandemic, insurers were, again, another requirement was to cover testing at 100%. And so when this policy was being discussed and actually discussed on federal level, one of the concerns was that employers across the nation, right, were going to, the guidance basically said, an employer can either pick up the costs themselves, or they can pass that cost on to the unvaccinated employee. However, that unvaccinated employee can go to any CVS, any testing facility and get a test at no cost, because insurers are required to cover diagnostic testing, not surveillance, which this would be surveillance, but diagnostic testing at no cost. And so the concern here was from a PEB perspective is if we now implement a requirement, we're going to have every employee going out and getting tested. And these tests, depending on where you go, a COVID test, a PCR test can be probably average about $130. And so if you've got an employee going out weekly and getting $130 PCR test because their employer is requiring them to get that, it's getting charged to PEB. So regardless, it's coming back to the PEB plan. And so that was the concern, is that how do we deal with this? How do we contain costs, especially if at the time we didn't know if the OSHA mandate was going to, was going to be implemented or, make it through the Supreme Court. But we had a plan regardless. And so that is where it gets complicated, because we end up paying for the test anyway, in one way or the other, with some exceptions to that, because again, I don't know, how many of you have gone and getting tested for COVID, but when I've gone, I've never been asked for insurance information. So someone's picking up the tab, but it hasn't been PEB. In those cases, it's been either state funded or it's been billed to the feds. And so there are situations like that. So in order for PEB to be able to track, to plan, and to contain cost and make sure that we are not paying for $130 for a test, and instead these are about $33, we're steering people to these tests versus the $130 versions of these tests, right? So that it gets very complicated. Hopefully that helps illustrate the picture.
And thank you. I just think it's really important that we have a very clear record. My concern is once you start down the surcharge road, there could be other conversations about other surcharges in the future. And to me, that sort of defeats the idea behind insurance and an insurance pool. So I just thought it'd be very important to get all these questions asked and answered and get everything on the record, because this is a very unique situation that the state and the employees are being put in. And I realize you guys have had to thread a very fine needle in figuring out how to address all the issues involved with employees and vaccines and vaccine mandates and everything that goes, and the insurance component that goes along with it. So thank you for answering all of our questions and completing this record. So are there any other questions from any other committee members at this time? Not seeing anyone else wishing to be recognized. Okay, so with that, we could go ahead and go on to the next portion.
Okay. So I think the next slide was plan benefit design restoration.
Correct.
Okay, so prior to the pandemic, PEB was projected to all but eliminate any excess reserves. But the pandemic changed that course and has somewhat complicated matters in that regard. So as a result of shutdowns and delayed care throughout both 2020 and 2021, PEB self-insured plans have accrued excess. And all those medical and dental expenses that would naturally occur in a normal year just weren't happening. People weren't going into the dentist because dentists were closed. People weren't getting elective surgeries because providers in hospitals were focused on pandemic-related care and also containing the spread of the virus. So because of that, a lot of those costs that we would have typically and had planned to incur didn't happen. And so that's where a lot of those excess reserves were accrued. But all of that delayed care is now coming back, and the plan is beginning to see a very, very significant spike in claims. That spike in claims is expected to continue for quite some time. That some time part is the million-dollar question: is how long is that going to continue? Add to that the volatility in healthcare costs in general, plus just the state of the economy and inflation factors. PEB is just hesitant to spend down all of the reserves that we've accrued throughout the pandemic, just because there's a good chance that actual claim expenditures are going to be higher than budgeted. And so we will need to dip into excess to cover those rebounded claims. So instead, with the assistance of actuarial modeling, what the PEB board decided to do is use a portion of the projected excess to fund the restoration of some of the benefits that were cut last year as a result of the pandemic-related budget cuts. And the focus here was to restore deductibles and out-of-pocket maximums back to pre-pandemic levels, and to be able to fund the restoration for 3 years to ensure that consistency in plan design. So similar to PERS's approach with that smoothing technique, we're also using the same smoothing technique as well, so that PEB is not continuing to yo-yo benefits year over year. Next slide. So this slide here, I think, just shows, it's a simple illustration of claims experience month over month. It's a snapshot here. The black line is what has been budgeted for. So you see that's our budget. But the green line is what we are mostly concerned about. The difference between that black and green line is what we're looking at. And you see that that green line, which is the overall rolling trend, so that's medical and RX and dental all rolled into one. You see that in 2020, we had that huge claims suppression, right? You see lower than normal claims coming in. And then right around March of 2021, we see it start jumping. And that spike has continued. This only goes through July of 21. However, month over month, PEB receives reports, and this spike is continuing. And so, the difference there between that black line and green line is what we're concerned about, because that's unbudgeted for expenses that we had not planned for. And so next slide is the chart that shows the decisions that were made by the PEB board for the upcoming plan year. So as you can see, PEB will be restoring plan design in most cases to very closely to pre-pandemic levels, or even at pre-pandemic levels. So I think this is a win, because we're able to at least restore the medical plan, the benefits that relate specifically to medical expenses that were cut during the last round of budget cuts. We were able to restore them, and we were able to fund them for the next 3 years. And so this was a big win for members, in my opinion, and I'm excited that we were able to, to at least restore that portion of those benefits. So with that, I will stop and take any questions on this portion.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the work on being able to try to get some of those deductibles back to where they were pre-pandemic, knowing that when there's a sick family member, those dollars have a significant impact on state employees' families. My one question is, we didn't have the low deductible plan then. So how did you evaluate that and come up with the dollars for that?
So, Laura Rich, for the record, we did not have the low deductible plan. That was something that was introduced this year, actually. So the point of having different plan options is just for that, so that people have different options for what fits their need, right? So the CDHP, that is a high deductible plan. It usually has the lowest premium, but it's got a pretty significant deductible. You're looking at $1,500 or $3,000 for a family, an employee or a family, and before the plan pays anything. So members who are relatively healthy, who don't use their insurance, they tend to like this plan because the premiums are low and they really don't plan on having to meet that deductible rate, but they need insurance for the sake of having insurance and having that safety net. But then you've got the EPO or the HMO, and those are usually, those appeal more to the more sickly crowd that might access benefits more often. And so those folks are usually more comfortable with paying a higher premium and knowing that when they go to the doctor, it's going to cost them a $20 copay or a $40 copay, depending on what kind of benefit they access. And so what that is called in the insurance world is actuarial value. And that is the difference between, what you pay up front versus what is provided in benefits. So the actuarial values, what we tried to do here is you have to spread them out enough so that people have choices. If you have 3 plans with the same actuarial value, it's not a choice, it's 3 of the same. And so what we did was we spread out, if you look at this, the actuarial value, that is the bottom, the bottom line of the chart, we kind of try to spread out the actuarial value of the plans. And so in doing so, that copay plan is in the middle. It's between the high deductible and between the HMO. And so we had to kind of finagle with the benefits a little bit to ensure that we could get that copay plan in the middle and that there was still enough spread between all 3 plans. And so there was a little bit of tweaking there of plan design to get that to fit. And that's why you see a slight difference in the HMO plan and the out-of-pocket maxes on the other plans as well. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Trying to go back to pre-pandemic levels with a plan that didn't exist pre-pandemic. I just wanted to understand the thought process behind how that was designed. So with that, committee members, are there other questions? I will go to Assemblywoman Peters first.
Thank you, Chair, so much for the question. I wanted to ask about your incurred rolling 12-month trend chart. A little short for me. I'd like to see it go back to maybe 2016 and what those trends look like to kind of see what a more like normalized fluctuation of use looks like over a longer period of time. And I'm also concerned and would like some clarification on the statement you made about the difference between the black line and the green line being unbudgeted. In part because one of the conversations we had during session was the reason we were proposing to keep the IBNR and catastrophic reserve levels so high is to help endure those kind of unpredictable swings. So can you just talk a little bit about how this plays into the conversation we had about those IBNR and catastrophic reserves during session?
Sure, Laura Rich for the record. So IBNR and catastrophic reserves are there just for those types of purposes. That catastrophic, it's those unpredictable swings, things that the actuaries did not expect to happen, something like COVID, right? The difference there is that you want to avoid using them as much as possible because they have to be backfilled. So in order to backfill them, if you use them, you have to backfill them, which means that then gets passed along to the employee in the form of a higher premium, right? You need to be able to collect that extra funding in order to backfill that account. And so eventually it does, you see it in rates. So those reserve categories are there. It's a great safety net. It is what what we need as a plan, to endure major catastrophes, especially, for example, if we do have a lot of high cost claims, which you'll see upcoming, this is something that we're concerned about. But, we had, I believe it was 2 years ago, we had a member with I believe it was somewhere around $7 million in claims when all was said and done. This is not something that PEB had budgeted for, right? This was an anomaly in trend, in something that we would not normally experience for one member. And so it made a significant impact. So it's things like that those reserves are meant to use as a safety net. But remember, if you use them as a safety net, you're going to have to collect those funds in the future. And so you end up, with increased premiums to backfill that.
Madam Chair, may I follow up?
Yes, Ms. Peters, go ahead. Sure.
Thank you so much. I guess I'm curious about how using those reserves, because they've been increasing, right? We've been seeing them increase over a period of time. How using those would change premiums more than what you're currently putting into those reserves today through the premiums that are in place today. So I guess I'm not understanding how using them would increase premiums if we're consistently seeing them creep up. Like, is there a cap or a floor on those that we have to be aware of? And if we exceed those, does that create a requirement to increase premiums? What does that look like?
Laura Rich for the record. So imagine the reserves as a savings account. You have a certain amount in your savings account that is relative to your yearly paycheck. As your paycheck increases, your savings account is going to want to increase as well if you want to continue that relativity. However, if you have to dip into savings because you had, let's say, a furlough or you lost your job and you have to dip into that, you're going to have to make that same amount of money and more the next year in order to be able to backfill into that savings account, right? And so it's similar to that. Our IBNR and catastrophic reserve levels are set based on our claims experience. And so, and I have an actuary here that can probably give you the actuary, terms for this. I'm trying to put it in, non-actuary, normal people speak. So it's a reserve level that fluctuates based on our claims experience. So if we've got $100 million in claims and the next year we have $120 million in claims, that reserve level, the requirements increase. And so every year that would increase. And that's typically what's happening, right? Because the cost of healthcare is increasing. We've got up until this year, we've had membership that's been either increasing or pretty steady, right? And so the plan, those reserve levels have been increasing, but it's relative to the expenditures of the plan. And so that is a requirement that goes into the overall budgeting of the program. And so if you dip into those, you have to refill them.
I'm sure Ms. Peters is going to have a lot more questions for you in the future, and I'm glad she does. So thank you. With that, other members of the committee, Senator Orenshaw.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wonder what were PEB's excess reserves at the beginning of this fiscal year, and how much of those reserves has been allocated to benefit changes in fiscal year 2022, 2023, and specifically for what?
So Laura Rich, for the record, thank you, Senator, for the question. So remember that the first thing that I have to clarify is that excess reserves, and I'm assuming you're focusing on excess reserves, correct? Okay, so excess reserves are projected. And so it's constant, it's a constant kind of moving target based on, what we're seeing. Obviously the projection in January of 2020 looked a lot different than the projection in February of 2021, right? And so there's the excess reserves are always a moving target based on what we're seeing in our experience and our claims. When the PEB board met in December to discuss and approve these policies, we were looking at approximately, because again, PEB has gone out to bid for almost every single contract in the last 2 years. And so we have a lot of contracts that are renewing. Some of them have very, very significant potential savings, projected savings. And so we had to build that in to obviously into projected excess as well, because of that those savings were not built into our budget when our budget was set. And so we were looking at about somewhere in the vicinity of $46 million or so. Now, out of those $46 million, we had some already allocated expenditures. For example, the Medicare HRA, the difference between $11, the PEB board had originally cut it to $11 per year of service, and during the last session, the PEB, the legislature then allocated that using, or restored that using excess reserves. And so we're funding, those are funded, and a few other things are funded as well using, they're already tagged expenditures. And so that brought that down quite a bit. And we used about $26 million of the $46 million spread over 3 years. So that's about $8.7 million a year. That $8.7 million will be on the Interim Finance Committee agenda tomorrow and will be discussed as well. So it really, the $26 million is spread throughout 3 years, even though it is projected excess for this plan year. And the reason why is because of the volatility of healthcare right now. And, we just don't feel comfortable spending down all of that because of the state of the world right now.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the answer, Administrator Rich. Thank you, Chair Carlton.
You're welcome, Senator. Other questions from other committee members at this time? Not seeing any. We can go ahead and move on, Ms. Rich.
So I think we can skip this one. This was the reports on audited financial statements. I think this one's, yeah. So we can go to 5.3, which is the utilization of PEB for the plan year ending June 30th of 2021. So this is, we're going from talking about our current situation to now talking about what happened in plan year 2021. So that is July 1st of 2020 to June 30th of 2021. So utilization for, the first one is utilization for the self-funded consumer-driven health plan, that's our CDHP. Medical costs decreased here by 6.8%. on a PMPM basis, but overall medical spend was down 8.3% in 2021 over 2020. And that's that claim suppression that I've been talking about. So due to the shutdowns, we saw a lot of care was postponed. And this is why we are seeing an increase in utilization today, because all of that delayed care and those delayed procedures and surgeries are now getting scheduled. Not just that, but also that delayed care has increased the need for more costly care, right? So things like maybe a stage 1 cancer is now potentially a stage 3 cancer. So all of those costs that didn't happen in 2021 are now happening in 2022. High cost claimants, these are claimants these are members with claims over $100,000. We monitor these very closely because just a few of these claims can have a very, very significant impact on the plan. As you heard me say, that $7 million member was obviously a high cost claimant. Some examples of high cost claims are premature babies. We call them the $1 million babies. They can be upwards of $1 million easily. New to this category, though, is COVID. We've seen several high cost claims for a COVID diagnosis come through. And if a member gets hospitalized and put on a ventilator and maybe has to get airlifted to another hospital to get a higher level of care, those costs quickly go up and end up on that high cost claimant category. Top costs by clinical classifications are pretty consistent year to year. Cancer is always a top driver here. ER visits and also urgent care visits dropped, but the cost per ER visit skyrocketed on the plan by 87.8%. This is largely because of the pandemic and the higher degree of emergent cases that we were seeing. Prescription utilization wasn't as affected by the pandemic. Overall costs increased 5.4%, which is expected. The plan picked up most of those increases. Members paid less than 1% more in plan year 21 over plan year 20, but the plan paid almost 70% more. So next slide is the EPO. So on the EPO, this is a little different. The EPO is similar to an HMO, for those of you who are not familiar, regional plan. Despite claim suppression, medical costs on the EPO still increased. Overall costs were up about 2.3%. And when you take into account the reduction in members, the PMPM per month costs increased about 8.9%. So we didn't see the same claim suppression on the EPO as we did with the high deductible plan. Members on the EPO are typically, like I said, sicker than those on the CDHP, but we're seeing a lot of the same trends happening here. Again, the high cost claimants account for almost a third of the medical costs to the plan. And the plan saw more of these high cost claimants in 21 with not just more in volume, but also higher than normal costs as well. Again, as you can see, cancer here is the top cost in clinical classifications, similar to the CDHP. However, the interesting thing that we see here is that infections made it to the top 3 list, which is not usually what you see in these categories. So it's probably safe to say that we had a couple of high cost COVID cases here, which is probably why you're seeing this category in the top 3. We had similar ER and urgent care utilization and costs here, except for ER costs didn't jump quite as much as on the CDHP. And then network utilization, very high on this plan because there is no out-of-network benefit on the EPO. EPO is a regional plan, and so it's different than the CDHP, where you do have an out-of-network benefit. So you're going to see a very high network utilization here. RX on this plan is also very similar to the CDHP. Overall prescription costs increased about 8%. The one thing that should be pointed out here is that we added a new copay assistance program to this plan. And without going into a lot of complex details about the program, because it is very complex, the copay assistance plan takes manufacturer dollars that drug makers are willing to give to new patients and then spreads them out throughout the year in order for the plan to leverage every dollar that that drug manufacturer is willing to give. And without that program, what happens is that we only get a percentage of what that drug manufacturer is willing to provide in copay assistance, because once that member meets their out of pocket or their deductible, they just stop providing copay assistance. So in the end, with this program, the patient ends up benefiting because they typically get that drug at little to no cost, and because they're able to apply those manufactured dollars. And the plan gets to apply the unused portion outside of their copay to reduce spending overall to the plan. But because that isn't taking into account into the overall data, that's what usually happens. This happened on the CDHP the first year we did this. The numbers look very skewed on the first year of the program. So you're seeing that, you know, the reality is that members did not pay 38% more in RX on this plan. It's really closer, probably to 2 to 4% when you take into account those manufacturer dollars that aren't applied in the stats here. This is not the PEB COVID-19 costs are not included in the packet, but I thought it was interesting to show how COVID impacted the plan. This is only for the self-funded plans only. Obviously, the HMO in Southern Nevada, which is fully insured, is excluded. You can see that the bulk of the costs were for treatment and hospitalization. It's probably safe to say that actual utilization of testing was much higher, but as I explained earlier, a lot of those testing costs are not being billed to the plan, at least not yet, because they're being picked up either by the feds or by other funding channels like the state, for example. So the testing costs are probably lower than what you'd expect here. The vaccine costs are attributed to administration fees. So the vaccine itself is free. PEB is not charged for the vaccine. However, as with most other vaccines, there's usually an administrative cost associated with it. And again, in this case, like many of the cost of vaccines and vaccinations are not billed to the insurer because no insurance information is being collected when folks go and get their vaccine. So this is a little lower than you'd expect as well. And the last one is our utilization for the fully insured HMO plan. This is offered in Southern Nevada. It's fully insured, meaning that PEB doesn't track the claims, doesn't handle the paying of claims, right? We pay HPN a monthly per member per month fee to administer the plan and pay the claims. And the Division of Insurance, just like with all other fully insured products, has oversight and authority over these types of plans. The HMO plan did not experience the same suppression that other insurers did in plan year 21 because of their capitation model. On top of this, the HMO plan saw, similar to what you saw in PEB's self-funded plans, a spike in high cost claims. So a combination of the capitation model and those high cost claims resulted in an almost 19% increase in HMO plan costs. You can see that diabetes is a huge driver on this plan. ER utilization was down, but costs were up, again, similar to what we saw on the CDHP. On the EPO, not CDHP. Average number of prescriptions per person is also very high on this plan. It's 50% higher than on comparable peer plans. A couple of things that are not on this slide, but I wanted to point out, it is in the packet. Utilization for inpatient services here dropped, but outpatient services remained pretty steady, but utilization in professional services increased by 8.7%. Bed days also increased here by 25%, which is different because on the CDHP, they actually decreased. Mental health disorders increased significantly on the CDH or on this plan, almost 13%. But the costs were up dramatically, almost actually over 100%. And alcohol-related disorders on this plan increased by 241%. We've seen this also on the self-funded side, but it was much less. It was more in the 20% range. We didn't see the 100% increase in costs that the HMO saw. So I will stop there for questions. I know that there's a whole lot of information here, and a lot was presented in your packet. I just went over the high level stats. So I'll stop, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. Utilization has always been something that I've been very interested in and tried to track. And I think over the next couple of years, being able to track this and see what the actual impacts of COVID were and in long term, because we have folks that still have not recovered. And I think that's another component that we're going to need to watch out for moving forward as far as utilization goes. So with that, questions from committee members on the utilization component? Seeing none, okay, I believe we can move on to the next item, which is the report on the material provided to the participants with enrollment in PEB.
Perfect. Okay, Laura Rich again for the record. Member communication, there's in your packet, there's a whole lot of information that is included here, including our communications plan and specific dates and information on what went out. But I think I'm just going to give the committee a high level overview of what kind of communication that we use to communicate with our members. This year has been a lot of communication just because of the plethora of changes we've had, also with not just with our contracts and with our vendors, but because of COVID and everything else going on in the world right now. We've released a lot of COVID communication, not just about coverage, but also about where you can get your flu shot, anything related to providing information and resources about COVID has been released by PEB in newsletters and things like that as well. As I said, we have plan benefit changes, and so a lot of communication has been released on that. We've sent out letters, we've sent out emails, we use different mechanisms for depending on what kind of communication it is. We had network changes. That was very important to communicate, and so a lot of information went out on that. Open enrollment meetings. We've been offering virtual open enrollment meetings for the last couple of years, and we're going to do that again this year. And it seems to be working. They are interactive, and so we use the webinar versions, and so it allows folks who attend to ask questions and to get real-time answers during that webinar. So that's been very successful. Also, we've been continuing our flu shot clinics. We've also had a couple COVID clinics as well. And we're constantly releasing these quarterly newsletters to keep everybody informed on what changes are happening within PEB. Also for our Medicare retirees, we have continued our pre-Medicare meetings to ensure that those who are aging into Medicare understand the process and understand the requirements, the PEB requirements for that. We've also sent out many HRA cap reminders. So back in, I believe it was November of 2020, we implemented a cap for the HRA accounts. And so we've been sending out reminders before that cap is implemented every May. And the Medicare open enrollment reminders as well. Every Medicare open enrollment period, we've got Medicare retirees who fail to use the PEB vendor to enroll into their Medicare plans. And so we lose them because they terminate off the plan, and that can really complicate things for those members. And so we try to work with RPEN and communicate that through different channels, as well as our own communications through emails and notices and things like that. So I will stop there. Questions?
Committee members, are there any questions? Not seeing any. Thank you very much for all of the work, especially with the retirees and the Medicare. I know once you get close to Medicare age, your phone starts ringing off the hook and they all tell you a little bit different stories. So being able to come to PEB and get what you really need to know when you retire is very helpful. Especially with all the folks we have retiring, what we heard earlier. So with that, I believe we can go to item number sub 5 under 4, the independent actuarial valuation of post-employment health and welfare benefits.
Correct, and I'm going to pass this portion of the presentation to Mr. Andrew White from Aon to provide a brief summary of the OPEB liabilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. White.
My name is actually Andrew Whitty with White Works as well.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's a very unnatural name. So in any case, I work for Aon, and our job this past year was to value your post-retirement medical plan, and I want to give you some context here. So basically what we do is you have a plan that you're providing benefits for people who are no longer working for the state. And the way the accounting works is you're supposed to account for these individuals while they're employed for you, and you have to have a reserve on your books. So typically what happens is the pay-as-you-go cost, which is we estimate to be about $50 million, is lower than the accounting cost, which we estimate to be about, it varies by year, but in the $70, $85 million range. For, and I'm not sure if you want to change pages here, but for example, page 266 of this report shows the accounting expense the last couple of years, 75 million and 85 million. And that's in contrast to the benefit payments, which have, as I said, run 40 to 50 million per year for the post-employment benefits. A couple key things about this plan that I think are very important for the group to know is a lot of states have post-retirement medical benefits, but a lot of entities, including the state of Nevada, have tried to pull away from them over the course of time. And specifically for you all, anyone hired after 12/31/2011 is not eligible to get a subsidized benefit from this plan. So over the many years that this plan has existed since then, it's slowly gliding downward in terms of body count and eventually in terms of liability. So, for example, there were about 13,000 eligible active employees 4 years ago. As of 2 years ago, that number had dropped to 10,000. And it'll continue to decline, obviously, as people have attrition out of the plan. The accounting cost is based upon what's called a look-back method. So the accounting cost is actually based upon the fiscal year 2021 accounting cost is based upon basically activity from 7/1/19 through 6/30/20. So it's called a look-back period because you're actually kind of going back a year to estimate how much the liability or how much the growth in the benefits were in that particular year. And that's in order to be able to provide numbers on a timely basis so that when you know what your benefit, you know what your accounting expenses during the year rather than having to wait till the year is over, which would be complicated or difficult to deal with, I would say. The plan is basically unfunded. You don't have any assets backing it up. So the interest rate to discount future liabilities is below 3%. So that makes the plan look quite expensive. And in fact, the liability of the plan is in the $1.5 billion range, and it's an unfunded liability. Sounds worse than it is, though, because the discount rate we're using, as I said, is below 3%, 2.5%. It's like that level. That's the basic highlights of the report or the information contained in the report. There's, if you look at the document you all have, there's 30 or 40 pages that goes over the details, but I certainly can answer questions or have any follow-ups or whatever.
Thank you, Mr. Whitty. With that, committee members, are there any questions? Not seeing any questions from any members at this time. So thank you very much. We appreciate you sitting through the meeting with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, committee members, that handles item number 5 on our agenda. Item number 6 is public comment, our second period of public comment. We're going to give it just a moment or two to allow people to dial in. We know there's a little bit of a lag time. So with that, we'll stand at ease for just a moment or two and allow broadcasting to prepare for public comment.
Thank you, Chair. To give public comment, please press raise hand in your Zoom window or *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue.
Kent Irvin, K-E-N-T-E-R-V-I-N for the Nevada Faculty Alliance. We work to empower faculty to be fully engaged in our mission to help students succeed. I'd like to thank all the committee members and the presenters, committee members for your questions and oversight of these benefits program. On the last point, I would like to comment on the ending of retiree healthcare benefits for post-2011 hires. Folks who were hired in 2011 in the state will have 15 years, the former vesting period for healthcare benefits in 2026. That's coming up. And that's when we will find our retirees out of state service starting to be left in the lurch without any state subsidies for their healthcare benefits, whereas other public employees in the state, county and many municipal employees will have retiree benefits and contribute to the non-competitive nature of state employment. So just keep that on your radar screen. Thank you.
Next caller.
Chair, there are no more callers for public comment at this time.
Well, thank you all very much. It was a very good meeting, very interesting. This will be the last time that I will be chairing this committee, so it will not meet again until December. That'll be after the next election cycle, so the new chair of Ways and Means will be taking over. I want to thank Mr. Hartz and Ms. Kaufman and all the staff that have educated me on this issue. And even though married to a state employee and the mother of a state employee, still healthcare is very, very complicated, and it's nice to be able to have these conversations and make sure that there's a public record on what types of benefits the state is providing to our state employees. It's an integral part of being able to keep state employees. So thank you all very much. We have IFC tomorrow. So to those that I'll see tomorrow morning, have a good evening, and everyone, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair.